Okay, now you can
Perfect.
introduce our speaker.
All right. So we have the pleasure of having Tracina Jackson with us. Tracina has almost 20 years of technical writing experience, specializing in the intersection of public health and technology. She's produced work for several organizations within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as both an embedded and peripheral contractor. And my favorite part of her bio, she is much, much funnier than that makes her sound. So we are going to do a little bit looser of a presentation today. We're going to have this be a discussion about technical writing across the disciplines. The blurb that we released is technical communication happens across many different industries, and knowing the ins and outs of each industry is crucial for shifting your career to new fields. Join us for a lively conversation about contract and government work. Learn about unique requirements needed to work for government employers, tips for making the transition into this field, and other topics related to government work and contracting. This session will be both informational and discussion based, and throughout we'd love to hear your experience as well about different industries, what hopping across those has looked like. So Tracina will have lots of different wonderful topics, and please feel free to contribute as we go. And I hope that this is just a really organic conversation that helps us all navigate this weird moment as we consider the industries we're in and where we might like to move to in our careers. So without much more, Tracina, it is all yours.
Hey, thanks, Jasmine. Hi, everybody. It is really nice to meet you. Jasmine said great things to say about the group. Please excuse the terrible, terrible lighting. I have a very old farmhouse with old wiring, and if I plug too many things into an outlet, it blows a fuse. So
I got an apartment like that, so I know what you mean.
yeah. Right. So as Jasmine said, I have done government contracting for quite a long time. I have about 13, 14 years of experience in that, most of it within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Some of it I've done in conjunction with people who have experience in Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the FBI, though I myself have not worked for those organizations. So what I would like to know first is what aspects of this are you all most interested in? I have an outline, I can get started, but what information do you want to hear about?
How is it different?
Awesome. Different from what? I'm assuming working in tech specifically.
How is government work different from any other work?
Okay.
If I may add something there, what's with all the background clearances? And if I, did something sketchy about 30 years ago, does that count?
Oh boy, yeah.
Well, tell us what it is.
Okay, so yeah, the background investigations, those are awesome, let me tell you. They take forever. They're really intrusive and they are intense. I have a public level trust, public trust level 5 clearance, which is the same clearance that people who are elected officials go through. And it reduced me to tears more than once. Okay. Yeah, it's not a fun process to go through. You have to come up with information that you never, never, never thought you would need to retain, like who your supervisor was at a job 7 years ago, and what their contact information is now. Why you would ever retain this, who knows? But the people who come up with these things assume that everyone has lived at one address in one house for most of their life, apparently, that everyone knows all of their relatives and where they live, and that none of your relatives have done anything sketchy that you may or may not know about. It gets wild. Whether they would dig up something that you had done 30 years ago, I guess it depends on like the level of the clearance you were looking at and what agency you were looking for. Some of them are looking into, some of them are a lot more conservative than others. If, for example, if you want to work for the FBI, you're going to wear a suit and tie every day, whether you are in their offices or whether you're on Zoom with them. It's a very formal environment. Some others are a little looser. but you're never going to be able to like go into their offices in yoga pants or pajama pants and Uggs. Okay, it's just not that kind of atmosphere. So yeah, the background checks are not fun. You will go through them for any government position. You may go through extra clearances depending on what agency you're working for and what kind of material you have access to.
Back when I was a sophomore, I guess it was a sophomore. I can't remember what I was in college in 1962. I got a job at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, the Bettis Atomic Power Plant, and I had to get a Q clearance. And that thing, it turns out they were also clearing all the Peace Corps people because the Peace Corps had just started up. And so I spent that whole job and left it, and they still hadn't finished getting my clearance. So they were still that fall going around and interviewing people that knew me. And of course,
we're still working on it.
I had to tell them, oh yes, I have lots of relatives in the Soviet Union. I know much about them, but there are lots of them there. So that was it. But I got my Q clearance finally, I think. Anyway, the next time I applied for a clearance when I was in Berkeley, I got it in 2 weeks. So,
Wow.
back to you. Sorry.
I am here to hear other stories too. That's cool. And that sounds about typical. Yeah, they take a really long time, and then once they're on record, the subsequent ones can take less time. But it depends. So what else do you all want to know?
Yeah. So, hey, Tracina, good to see
Hey!
you. So, I mean, Richard kind of touched on it a little earlier, rather you did. So as somebody who's kind of looking around right now, and I've got a background in tech, like what would be a, I don't know, government job that might align close to what I might know about already? Just looking for some, somewhere to start, because it's very like just so different from what I've done.
It is. Okay, so break that down into two parts. The looking for a job in contracting, and secondly, what is it like to work for the government? So okay, most contracting happens with, okay, I have to back up because it's so very, very different than private industry. It's so completely different. I have to figure out where to start here. Government contracts are typically put out for bid. Okay, some of them are created specifically for certain companies, like usually really big ones like Raytheon or Boeing, something like that. But a lot of them are put out for bid. Many companies will bid for the contract. They don't always go to the lowest bidder, but they often do. One of the things that companies have to show is that they have the staff to fulfill the contract. They don't actually have to have the staff hired. They don't actually have to have these employees. They just have to show that they could fill the position if they got the contract. So very, very often they'll put out calls for certain positions. They'll gather a lot of resumes, and they'll use those resumes without your knowledge. They'll use those resumes to show that they could fill that position with someone like you. Okay, this means that it can take months to hear back from these companies if you submit a resume, because they're going to wait to find out if they win the contract. And if they do, only then are they going to sort through the resumes and maybe get back to you. So it's a long process. It's a frustrating process. They ghost a lot of people. That's just the way it is. Right? Unfortunately, it's crap. It's a crap system. A better way to get into one of these companies is networking, but of course that means that you have to already know someone in that sort of field with those sorts of companies. That can be difficult.
So you're talking about jobs with private companies doing government work.
Yes, you as an individual will rarely to never be able to have a contract with the government on your own. They don't hire freelancers that way. It's not cost efficient for them.
What about regular employees?
That is beyond my scope. I mean, being hired by the government is a process all its own. It can literally take years. Um, it's so very different from private industry. There is a long process. They have certain regulations they have to adhere to when they're evaluating candidates and resumes. There used to be, I believe there still is, although it's been modified, there used to be a point system. If you were a veteran, you got so many points. If you were advanced, you had an advanced degree in this field, you got so many points, and only resumes with a certain threshold of points were even reviewed, right? This is, I believe this has been modified, but at one time, the points that a resume got from being submitted by a veteran overshadowed everything else. So any veteran applying for a position was going to get that position. And there just, there wasn't much you could do about that. You know, if you didn't have the qualifications that gave you those points, you weren't considered for a government job, right? There are so many experts on that, on what you have to do to apply, on what you can do to apply, on how to get your resume noticed or whatever. But it's really a very bureaucratic system. It's beyond my scope. I decided not to go down that road, in part because I didn't really like a lot of the regulations that were necessary for government employees. And I didn't like the idea of my employment being tied to someone's political whim. So I stuck with contracting, and then I went to private industry, which I liked quite a lot. And then I got lured back into contracting with an offer that I couldn't refuse, doing what was pretty much my dream job. So the environment is highly regulated. If you are someone who gets annoyed at bureaucracy, at administrative tasks, at having to account for your time down to 15-minute increments if you're working on a contract, if you don't like the paperwork involved, if you hate doing monthly status reports, for example, this is not the kind of job for you. These things are necessary, and they're tightly regulated. There are federal laws backing up a lot of these things, such as the timekeeping. You have to account for government money that is spent when it's spent on these contracts. You not only have to log your time working on the contract, but on each specific project. And as I said, it goes down to 15-minute increments, and it is it's a federal crime to falsify your timesheet. So they're really strict about it. You have to turn it in by a certain time the next day. Usually that's by like 11 a.m. the day after the work that's done. You have to sign off on every timesheet when you submit it, saying that this is true and accurate, and that you understand the penalties for falsifying or I won't say making mistakes, but that you understand the severity of submitting an incorrect timesheet, for example.
Are the penalties for that more than just firing?
Yes.
Well, there.
Yes. They can include fines and jail time.
Really? Wow.
Yes. Yeah, they can. You will go through a lot of trainings, and these trainings are to help you understand the federal regulations that you have to adhere to as a contractor, working within federal systems and working with federal materials. So you will go through trainings on the Government Records Act. These are extensive. Having gone through them, you realize how ridiculous certain claims being made about someone not really understanding that classified documents can't be taken out of specified areas are, because there's no way that you sit through these trainings and don't understand that. They have you run through training scenarios from everything, if you walk into the print room and on the printer is a classified document, what do you do? And the answer to that is you stay where you are, you guard that piece, you do not look at it, you call security, right? They are really, really specific about these things. You will go through trainings on what to do if someone calls in a bomb threat. You will often, if you work on site, you will go through active shooter trainings. I mean, this stuff
Right.
is
Wow.
intense. Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if the person you alluded to ever went through any of those trainings.
I also would be very surprised, but the individuals around that person would have had to sign off on the trainings, and it's ludicrous to claim, after what I know they were exposed to, that they simply didn't understand. They didn't know this was a problem. There's no way you come out of those trainings with without a very good understanding of what precisely is and is not allowable.
Relatively sort of almost getting into the weeds thing, the trainings and the filling out of the timesheets and all, that's all done on the clock, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there are special codes they give you for the trainings because there are they can be charged to certain projects, but they typically have their own time codes so that you can show that you've gone through the annual trainings. You will go through cybersecurity trainings. You will go through physical security trainings. Even where I was working for the CDC, we were taught what to do if you're approached by a foreign national asking for government secrets. I kid you not. You're taught things like you don't wear your identifying badge outside of the campus. You don't wear it out to lunch because it identifies you as a government employee, specifically as a CDC employee. So that always has to be hidden when you're off campus. They really get specific. There are a lot of trainings about that kind of thing. Where I was, because I'm working with health records, I also had to take annual HIPAA training. You go through a lot of trainings, and you go through them often. They repeat them every year, not always exactly the same trainings, but on the same topics, so that you have refresher courses. If this annoys you, if this is not something you want to deal with, it's not for you. There's no getting around these things. They are required.
I have a question about technology. I was doing a little bit of a Google search. Position of public trust and security clearances are not the same thing.
They are not.
Yeah, if you could expand on that.
I have never gotten an answer what makes them different. Okay? Because we ask them that each time. They say this is not a security clearance, this is not technically a security clearance. Okay, then what is it? They cannot define it more than that. For shorthand, we call it a clearance. It is not actually clearance, which are your secret, your top secret, and so on. But they have no other definition for it. They've never explained to us what the difference is between this and a clearance.
What kind of clearance is this that's classified?
Yeah. Yeah, what makes the difference between one and the other? They can't tell you. So
Yeah, see, my sister, she's 10 years younger than I am, and she works for a Lockheed, a contractor in upstate New York that does government contracts, and she's in the IT department. She's not a tech writer or anything like that. I need to ask her what level of clearance, but she did say that, you know, this business about security, you know, when you go into an area, you know, there are some requirements where documents you can only look at in a certain special area. You have, and she says that they make them take out their phones, their laptops. They can't bring anything electronic in there. Okay, so what is that a public trust? Public, yes,
that is far beyond. That is far beyond. Those kinds of documents require very specific need to know status, and then you have to have all kinds of clearances to do it, and there are processes and procedures to go through to be permitted to even know about these areas and, you know, what's in them. That is far beyond what I wanted to do. I never wanted to be involved with that level of secret. I have a simple life. I'm a homesteader. I like my sheep and my chickens. I never wanted to know government secrets that could get me kidnapped. Okay. So
yeah, okay. So and Richard said something about a Q clearance. What is that?
the gentleman who had that would need to explain that one. Would you come on back and tell us what a Q clearance is?
I did. Yeah, I had a Q clearance. I think it was. There was a thing called the Atomic Energy Commission once upon a time, the AEC, and the clearances for them were called Q clearances. The different agencies or the different branches of government have different hierarchies of clearances, and the AEC had what was called a Q clearance, which is about the same as a secret clearance in some other branches of government.
Yeah. Again, I'll just put the information, the definition that I found. You know, a public trust is not a security clearance and can be granted on a very basic criminal and credit check. A public trust does not confer access to classified information and is therefore not a security. A public trust is often required for IT or financial positions supporting the government. So that's the definition I found. And
I think it's hilarious that they consider the checks a basic background check, because I think mine was 47 pages.
Yeah. And here, I'll put the link in the chat, and then I'm quoting from it too. So, oh dear, but yeah, have to go to the Google search, you know. So I'll put that. So the different parts of the government have different names for these categories and what you can. So you can't doesn't confer access. So you've never had access to classified information?
I have never, and I never wanted it. I chose to avoid positions where I would need that kind of clearance.
Did you say you worked for the CDC or are working for the CDC now? Were you working there during the pandemic or tail end?
Yes.
You
yes,
did.
It was.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's rough.
It was, and some of the safety issues that came up around that contributed to my decision to leave for private industry.
Okay.
I'll just put it that way.
All right.
Yeah. So looking in the chat, who's interesting to work for? What government divisions are hiring tech communicators? Everybody wants tech communicators. The problem is they don't pay well. All right. This is one of the big differences between government and private industry. All right. Tech pays pretty well, pays well enough to make a decent living on as a tech writer. Government contracting, as I said, is not always the contracts are not always awarded to the lowest bidder, but they often are. And rates are set by the GSA, the General Services Administration, and they're not what you would be used to working for startup, well, not startup companies, because those can be crap, working for tech companies, right? Your benefits are not going to come anywhere close to it. Stock options, typically you're not gonna see that. These people want you for a certain contract. They're not terribly concerned with your long-term career goals or keeping you happy for longer than the length of the contract, which is often 5 to 10 years. 10 years is a long contract in government contracting.
So when you have one of these contracts, are you a W-2 employee or are you an independent?
You are a W-2.
Mhm.
There are a few companies, very small companies typically, that will hire you technically as a freelancer, but that's they get some investigation by the Department of Labor because you're not actually an independent contractor, but they like to classify you that way.
Mm.
Yeah. Um,
Statutory employee. I've heard.
yeah. Yeah. Um, there are a couple of the main types of government contracting are embedded or peripheral, and those are not official names. They don't really have official names, but those are the best descriptors that I've come up with. When you're embedded, typically you're working on the kind of contract that the government is always going to need one way or another, and who gets that contract rotates.
Mhm.
These are often like small business set-asides, for example. The government has certain contracts that they reserve exclusively for small businesses in order to promote small businesses and help grow them. Small businesses that win government contracts don't stay small businesses for long. And so they're typically not able to rebid when the contract comes up for its next cycle in, say, 5 years. This means that when you're an embedded employee, you're working within the government systems. You're in their offices. If you go into their offices, you're more aligned with their office culture than your employer's office culture. You typically see your employer's manager maybe once a year when they tell you that your annual review is fine, but you're not getting a raise. That happens a lot. Um, uh, you don't have a strong attachment to the company that's signing your paychecks. You are more familiar with and more embedded in the government system that you're working in.
Mm.
And when another company wins the contract, they just change your badge to reflect that you are associated with a different organization now, and you continue doing everything that you always did, typically with worse benefits, and your 401k starts all over, and you have new health insurance with the new company, and so your deductible all starts over, and it's really, really annoying. And there's a certain level of security with an embedded position, because part of the contract requirement is that there's a smooth transition, which means that they're incentivized to keep you on, and to at least pay you well enough that you sign with them. Again, they don't want a situation where all the old employees who have all the institutional knowledge don't sign up and they don't have a staff. That's not good in terms of being positioned to win other government contracts later. But it does mean that you have very little say in things like the corporate culture. You take it or leave it. You don't get to pick and choose. You don't get to choose your company. Whatever their benefits are what they are. Some are relatively good. Some are, a few that I had were great. A lot of, especially small businesses, are crappy, particularly if they've been very small. This is their first big government contract. knocks them into the big time. Suddenly they go from a staff of 25 to a staff of 500, and they don't have the infrastructure for it. As the first couple of years are typically pretty rough. And the health insurance particularly is crap. So the other kind is the peripheral employee, and that's what I am now. And it's what I prefer. And I can't see ever going back to being an embedded. You're choosing the company that you're working for. You're choosing the corporate culture that you want to be part of. You are working on particular projects that there's a contract for. At the end of this contract, if it's finished, if it's not renewed, you know, you've worked with the CD, or you've worked with the government staff, you've formed alliances and friendships and relationships, but that work relationship is over when the contract is over. So I really prefer being able to choose the company that I work for. Let's see. What were some of your favorite work projects at the CDC? Oh, working on the World Trade Center Health Program, without a doubt. Also some of the most intense work that I did. Impossible not to be emotionally affected by that work. But it was very fulfilling, really interesting at the time. The program was basically a startup. It had been originally funded for only a few years. They thought that was all it was going to take, and then they discovered long-term health problems that were going to take decades to treat and resolve and deal with. And so the contract was, or the mandate was extended for 99 years. So it's now an ongoing project. But we had to take it from a tiny program that was, it was never expected to be long term. And so they didn't do things like organize their documentation in a way that made it easy to access again. They thought they would never have a big body of it. They thought it would be, you know, in 5 years or so that would be the end of it and everything would be archived. So we had to rebuild their system. And that was pretty cool. Pretty intense because of the subject matter, you know. And in addition to looking at the documentation as something to be organized, we also were always very aware that we had to make this as easy to understand as possible, because the people who were looking for this information were often very frightened because they had received some very scary diagnoses. They were frustrated because they had typically been dealing with bureaucracy for years, trying to get their conditions identified and treated. And we didn't want it to be any harder than it had to be for them to find what they needed. So without a doubt, that was the most interesting, the coolest, and also the most heartbreaking project that I worked on. It was very, very difficult to hear some of those stories.
So when you did that, were you embedded or peripheral?
I was embedded.
And Tracina, just out of curiosity on that note, did you find that there was a lot of empathy in like your fellow like folks you worked with when dealing with the social matter? Like, you know, I've spent time in tech and it can be pretty sociopathic.
Yes.
So just wondering what that was like to work in that environment.
The types of people who go into public health, particularly into public service in public health, want to do good in the world. They have some blind spots sometimes. A lot of them from that background have families that have been upper middle class. They have a culture. They're a part of a culture where everyone goes on to get advanced degrees in college. And so it's difficult sometimes for them to understand where you have to be when you're communicating with people who don't have that same cultural background. People whose first language may not be English. People who can perfectly well understand what you're telling them if you use plain language instead of medical terms. You know, that can be a little hard to get across to them because they grew up around people who all understood all of these things, all of these ideas, all these concepts about science or medicine that you're presenting. But not everyone has that background, and they don't understand how to talk to people who don't have that background. And that's where the tech writer comes in.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Because, yeah, it's a very different ball game, and the stakes are very, very different from a lot of what I've experienced.
It is. Now, the people that I've talked with who came to the CDC from the Department of Defense, for example, tell me that the culture there is quite different, even within the VA. So it depends very much on which field precisely you are dealing with.
Mm.
Can you share what an average pay rate would be when you say it's very different for government technical
Yeah,
communities?
yeah, that's really hard to. That's boy, that's. I don't know that I can give you an average. The GSA pay scales are often published. You would have to figure out where you fall on that. It's not always easy to tell. If you do go into government contracting, you need to be really aware that your earning potential is going to be very much defined by your formal education in your field. And what I mean by that is if you don't, for example, have a master's degree, you cannot ever earn more than a certain amount of money because they simply will not advance you to the next level. That degree is considered an integral part of the experience you have to be considered a subject matter expert too, for example. Without it, it doesn't matter if you have 30 years of experience and memberships in several professional organizations. It does not matter if you don't have the degree. You don't qualify for that designation. So that's something to be aware of. I know a lot of us don't have advanced degrees in those fields. We have picked this up over decades of work. We know all of these things. We're constantly educating ourselves, but we don't have the formal credentials, and that will at some point limit your earning potential.
So sorry. Now to jump into that in terms of pay scale and all, both pay scale and otherwise, does where you work matter? I mean, are you based in the Bay Area, or if you work closer to the seat of government, either at the state or government or federal level, does that matter?
When you're a federal employee, where you live does make a difference. There are supplemental charts for like how much gets added to base pay for this position depending on where you live. When you're a contractor, that doesn't come into play. They are the contracting company knows that they have a certain amount of money designated for each position that they have to fill, and in geographical location doesn't matter there. So this is one of the reasons that it's really hard for government to find like top-notch tech developers. Why would anyone contract with them or even work for them directly when they can earn quite a lot more money in a tech company that's paying them rates that lets them live in places like San Francisco? So people with those skills, people with that knowledge are highly, highly desirable. Whether you would find the rates that they can offer you appropriate, that's a lot more doubtful.
Well, I'll tell you a quick story about myself. So back in mid-90s, I was trying to get my first job as a contract technical writer in the area, and I'd done a couple little jobs, and I got sent over for an interview at Microsoft, and I have a master's degree. I also have an undergraduate degree in biology. And so they were interviewing me as a science editor for Encarta. You may remember Encarta, long dead.
Mhm.
And the terrible working conditions. We all were side by side in a little carrels in a conference room. And the person who interviewed me could not tell me over and over again how stressful that job would be. It was just awful. But they were paying $17.50 an hour, which was pretty darn low, even back then. And then I got offered a job, but I'd have to move to DC to do it. And it was working for Electronic Data Systems on an INS contract as a technical editor. So I took it because I think it paid in the mid 30s. And I'm from DC, so I went to go live back there. And like you were talking about, I had to wear a suit every day, except casual Fridays, which were very difficult to figure out how to dress for. And it was fantastic. I spent about 3 months there, got paid well, got steeped in learning about the government printing office, the GPO style guide, and how to edit per the GPO style guide, which was fantastic training. But at the end of the time there, they offered me a full-time job. It was in the mid 50,000s, I think. And I said, thank you very much, but I can go back to Seattle and wear whatever I want. And I left all my suits behind and went back and got a better paying job. But I tell you this story just because what I really appreciated about that experience was the rigor of the editing and the really learning how to be a good editor and handle large volumes of information. The information that I was working on, I thought was interesting because it was for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and they were working on, fingerprint and that, using fingerprints to get over the border, and that was sort of early days for those types of things, biometrics. But when I came back here and working for tech companies since, I will tell you that what I actually lament sometimes is this kind of loosey-goosey, nobody has editing chains anymore. It's just kind of peer-to-peer editing. Everybody's used different style guides if they've ever used one. You know, I worked at Microsoft and everybody was very well versed in how to use the Microsoft style guide. Since then, it seems like people just kind of go, oh, I make it up. It's very messy. So I will say that I guess as my own personal experience gave me a certain respect for having the rigor and having some regulated environment, even though, as you say, if you get a chance not to work for the bureaucratic side of it, that would be a big plus. What I do think is a downside is I was just visiting a friend in DC who's worked on contract for years. He's a GIS programmer, so Geographic Information Services mapping, and he works for the Forest Service on contract, basically, for the USDA is who they fall under. And what I really realized, it was a big difference between his job and my job in the tech industry is, as you said, stock options. For those of us who have worked in the tech industry for years, the ability to purchase employee stock through ESPP programs has been tremendous if you've been in it for any period of time. So I guess to sum up, I wouldn't see a lower paying contract as being that bad in your early years, plus to get a lot of good experience. But certainly in terms of building great wealth, it was kind of sobering for me to realize that I've worked just as hard as my friend, but I think I've amassed more stock than he has for sure.
Well, ESPP is a very good program, but stock options are a lot more iffy.
Yeah, they are, but they're not something that you often see in federal contracting at all. I always, because of that, I always regarded them as a lovely extra and never made any financial decisions based on them. So, okay. Where am I working now? I am working for an employee, a small company, a consulting company working in tech and public health that is working to reduce the burden of compliance with federal regulations on hospitals and small clinics. And we went entirely employee owned at the end of December of last year. And we are a B Corp, which is a corporation that is specifically created to have a social welfare component. So we can't ever be taken over by like venture capitalists that then basically take the company apart and destroy its mission simply
Yeah.
to bring higher returns for stockholders, because baked into the type of company we are is that social welfare aspect. What else does anyone want to know, or what stories do you want to tell about your own experience?
So you talked about the best project you work on. So what's the worst, if you can say it?
Oh boy. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, which one am I allowed to talk about? Because I have several NDAs in effect. Oh man. Oh boy. I think
Vague is okay too.
yeah, I think yeah, it had to be the one where it was a huge project. It was a very public facing project, and the requirements for it kept changing, but no one had ever specified what the requirements were at the beginning. So there was no change log, and there was no record of how the changes they were asking for would affect the timeline. So I know that's super, super vague, but wow, that one was bad. There was also the one that had to do with classifying the kinds of injuries that came out of the yeah, can I even talk about that one? There was a very public event that happened in the Gulf of Mexico with a petroleum producer. And yeah, some of you probably know what I'm talking about. Congress wanted reports, real-time reports on injuries sustained by the people who were helping to clean up that that
Was it BP?
well, I can't tell.
I still haven't
I
bought.
can't tell you that because I am actually still I can be subpoenaed to testify about it, so I can't talk about it. That was terrible. Reading what was happening to the people in order to classify the types of injuries and the types of illnesses was just awful. And it was high pressure. These reports were going to Congress in near real time, and it was just working in public health. If you are dealing with the stories of real people interacting with these issues, is intense. People do burn out for a reason. There's only so much you can absorb. And if you are the kind of person who is at all empathic, and those are the kinds of people who go into public health, it takes a toll. You have to find a way to disconnect. You have to find a way to have a life outside of that, and a way to process what's happening, what you know is happening to people. And you have a very limited ability to affect any of it for the better. Probably not as fun a bad story as some others I could tell, but I have to be discreet here. So moving from non-government work to government work is a one-way trip. No, it's not. It can be tricky with the work samples, as you point out. A lot of the work that you do for the government is going to be uncredited. It can be difficult to prove that the work that's up on a website is your work. You get the best credentials that you can. Sometimes you just have to create your own samples because you can't use any of your public ones. I was fortunate. I was able to use a few. They're now outdated because other people have gone in and edited and changed them since then. Web pages are typically reviewed every year. in the government and updated. So it can, you have to plan ahead. You have to have people who can speak to your work. You have to find a way around the issue of work samples. And in my case, I was really lucky. The websites that I was working on were public facing, and so I could point to them. In a lot of other cases, some of my very best work were security documents that I cannot excerpt. I cannot show any part of that. They don't belong to me, and they're locked away behind access controls. So that part's tricky.
All right. Well, we're kind of nearing the end, so if I can be selfish and ask a final question. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And just kind of thinking about the breadth of what we discussed, I guess what would the biggest piece of advice, if you could go back to yourself at like the beginning of this journey, what would you tell yourself?
To look at the trade-offs, I think, because I think that I stayed in the embedded contracting part too long because I really cared about the mission that I was part of, even when the working conditions of the contractors kept deteriorating. We stayed in large part because we really believed in the mission. I don't know that I would do that anymore. Or I don't know I would do it. I don't know that I would do it for as long as I did. There were so many things that I enjoyed about being an embedded contractor, but I would never go back to it now. No. It was great for a certain time in my life. And now I want different things. So I would say, yeah, look at the trade-offs and figure out where the tipping point is for you.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, especially with everything you've discussed, like the detail that you've provided. Thank you. This has just been really helpful.
Thank you. I hope that I've been able to answer your questions. I hope that I haven't rambled too much. It's a little late here, and my rooster will have me up in just a few hours. So I'm doing my best to stay focused here.
No.
So the last few questions, I don't want to leave anyone hanging. No, you're not obligated to stay until funding dies. You are an at-will contractor. You can always leave when you need to leave. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Oh my gosh, you are all so very, very kind. You say such nice things. I appreciate it. It's been lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been great. And as always, just thank you for sharing. And if you're comfortable, if questions roll in, I'll forward them to you and keep the dialogue going. But thank you, Tracina. I know it's late your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer. We appreciate you from the Bay. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's
I'm good. Oh, go ahead. Continue. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just saying it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, I am going to stop the recording here.